Robert Murray, MLB Insider for FanSided, a guy who has been, I think just about as plugged in as anybody right now. He's an awesome follow on Twitter, so give him one there. What's up, brother? How are we doing today?
Hey, I'm great, man. How are you? Happy holidays.
Sorry. For some reason, I thought you were a Toronto guy. I thought you were Canadian.
No, I'm kind of close. I'm originally from Wisconsin, so I guess that's as close as you can get, I think.
You're a bit of a man.
Actually being Canadian.
You're a man of mystery, buddy. Because people were talking. I was like, I'm trying to get Robert Murray on. It's gonna be a while. And people were like, is he from here? Is he a Toronto guy? Is that how he's plugged in with this team? And I was like, I actually don't know. I was like, all right, let's give it a shot. And then I have a rule. I'm such a bad guy. I have a rule that I tell my producers, like, no asking Americans on Thanksgiving. Let them have their awesome day. And to be fair, my show is before football, so it's kind of a cheat. But I would never. If I was noon and you would have been like, hey, it's American, I would have backed out immediately and said absolutely not. But I had two guys living in the States today on my show. I feel like I'm a bad guy. I'm a really, really bad guy. I hope you don't hold that against me during this interview, but I am sorry. I did, for some reason, think that you were a Toronto dude. And maybe that's because, again, you've been dropping little sneaky Toronto bombs everywhere. You know, you've been throwing out some breadcrumbs throughout this offseason. Everyone's a lot of people. You lead my Twitter in DMs I receive from "Did you see this?" Okay, and it's about the Blue Jays.
Love it.
Yes, that's the best. That's the highest call. Hey, did you see this from Robert Murray? So let's start with a big one. You the other day you said, "quote Toronto could be aggressive on both the trade and free agent markets. They could make a splash." And you did give it a caveat of this is coming from rival executives and that it has to be the right fit. But did you think when you laid that report out that one of those names could include Bo Bichette?
I did not necessarily think that. So the reports the last few days have kind of caught me off guard with that. Mm-hmm. And surely this is the time of the year where teams listen on everyone. That's their job, is to listen on these players and see what's out there. And a guy like Bo Bichette, he's under contract for the next 2 years at a pretty affordable rate. And surely that's going to be of interest to teams for sure. And that's the Blue Jays, if they ended up moving him, could end up getting an absolute haul in return, because that's a highly valuable player, really good player, signed cheap, and he's controllable. You can end up getting a pretty sizable haul. But that being said, I don't necessarily think the Blue Jays are going to be in any hurry to move Bo Bichette. I would put the chances of a trade at unlikely. I would never rule anything out, because you never know what kind of offer a team could make, especially a team like the Chicago Cubs that have been rumored by John Morosi. Mm-hmm. But I'm of the belief, though, that unless something changes, he'll end up being on the opening day roster next year. That's what I'm thinking as of right now.
Yeah. The second question of this, though, is like when we're saying the Blue Jays could make a splash, right? Could that splash be a step backwards? Because I think that everyone reads that and they go, oh, they're trying to do something that would convince Ohtani to come, right? That's part of the reasoning of the Cubs trying to get Bo Bichette, is that they would be saying to him, hey, look how serious we are about trying to win, is we would move basically a ton of our farm system to be able to get this shortstop in this win now window to help acquire you. But yeah, do you think that because of that market and because of just where free agency is and where trade is, that, a Blue Jay splash could also be interpreted as, hey, these guys actually might sell high on a guy like Bo? And you said he's unlikely, but what about a dude like Vlad?
I think that's another one where they can end up listening as well. We would look at both Bo Bichette and Vlad Jr. Those are highly valuable young players. And I think that's going to end up being another guy who's in a similar boat as Bo, is in the fact that he's young, he's controllable. He's someone that I think a lot of teams are going to end up liking. Obviously, there are questions that come with Vlad, and there's also, but I think he's someone that the organization should try to build around instead of trading, because when you sign a guy like, let's say they do end up making a splash in free agency. They get an Ohtani, or they get a Bellinger, or they re-sign Chapman, or they do something else that's out there. You're going to want to have some controllable young players, and those two have not gotten their big payday yet. And I think having those two alongside another big piece that is going to be on a high salary, I think that would be really important for them, especially as they try to compete in that division. I just don't know. I don't see the Blue Jays trading either one of those players, especially since they want to be competitive, and it seems like they are very open to making a splash in this offseason, whether it's by a trade or free agency. So I just don't think they should trade either one of those two. But if they get blown away with an offer, then maybe that thinking changes, but I don't know if that offer is going to end up coming.
Yeah, I think the reason why people keep interpreting, or the way that at least I do, I'll just say me, the reason why I keep wondering if it is going to be one of those guys is when we hear things like, hey, they're going to make a splash. Look at the free agent market, and of course Ohtani would be that, right? But if they have to be a realistic landing spot for Ohtani, and it feels the same way with Bellinger, that he's just going to be able to get paid. So it sounds like what I'm reading from you is that the most likely outcome for this team, though, when it's talking about a splash, is something via free agency, even though this is widely considered as a pretty thin free agent market.
Yeah, I think that's going to end up being the case, is that it is a pretty thin free agent market, especially when it comes to the hitting side. You're looking at Ohtani, you're looking at Bellinger, you're looking at Chapman, and then you have a couple other pretty good options, and then it just drops off. And, maybe the Blue Jays can end up exploring something via trade where they add instead of subtracting one of their young stars. I don't necessarily know what that would look like right now because the trade market is still kind of formulating, and I think the Blue Jays are in the process of making those calls to identify what players are available. But I think if I'm reading what I'm hearing correctly, is they're aggressively exploring both the free agent and the trade markets, and they're trying to get themselves better. And that's why I don't understand the Bo Bichette rumors. Anything is possible, but I can't see it. At least as of this moment, I can't see it.
Do you view them as realistic dark horses for Ohtani and for Bellinger?
I think Bellinger is probably the more likely of the two, in my opinion. I think Ohtani is they have the money for Ohtani. They definitely have the money, in my opinion, and that's going to end up being a $500+ million contract. And I know there's even some people in baseball who think that contract could still approach $600 million because everything that comes with Ohtani, obviously the on-field performance, but the marketing and everything that comes with him off the field is super valuable. And I think the market for him is going to be pretty extensive. But right now, I would put the Dodgers as the leader in the clubhouse for Ohtani, and I think that's what a lot of people in baseball think. But when it comes to Ohtani, though, information is incredibly tough to come by. And he has wanted to keep this process incredibly secretive. He does not want any leaks. And if you try to talk to other teams about him or you try to talk to his camp, you will not get anything in return. It is basically, it's like trying to read the tea leaves, and there are not many tea leaves to read. But I think Bellinger, if we're shifting to Bellinger here, his agent is Scott Boras, and he is trying to get him the biggest contract that he can possibly get. And he said at the GM meetings that if you want to sign Bellinger, you're going to need a full belly because it's going to end up requiring a pretty big appetite to sign him. And so there's some people who think that contract could approach $200 million. I know one of the teams that has been linked to Bellinger is the New York Yankees, but they do have some concerns internally about him. And I don't know if they're going to end up being the top suitor for him. If you look at another possible suitor, the San Francisco Giants, and they have the Farhan Zaidi connection from their Dodger days. So certainly the fit there makes sense, and they've been trying to add a star. I'm curious to see where that contract ends up. As I said, the $200 million number is one that has definitely been floated out for Bellinger. The Blue Jays, they could use an outfielder as well. So I think that could end up being a realistic fit. And I'm just really curious to see which direction they end up going in. But both of those guys make sense.
Yeah. That's a big chunk of change for Cody Bellinger for this team. And it feels like it does remove them from some flexibility from some other moves, which is why it's so hard to interpret the free agent thing. But have you heard, by the way, don't report if Ohtani does come here, because after that passing report, we were talking about it, people will blame you. If they don't get him, you will become a public enemy here. So even if you get that, just sit on it. The scoop isn't worth it to be hated by everybody in Toronto for a decade to come. Are there any other names in free agency though that you've heard Toronto linked to then? Because like you said, it's not very deep, but there's a lot of starting pitchers. That doesn't seem to make too much sense for Toronto, but maybe it's one of those names. When you're trying to read these tea leaves, who are the names that maybe do come up for you when trying to interpret what Toronto could do if it isn't Bellinger or Ohtani?
Yeah, I think obviously a reunion with Matt Chapman would make a whole lot of sense. They could definitely use another bat, and third base remains something that they could try to fill here. And I think I don't necessarily know how strong the market is for Chapman quite yet. He was at the GM meeting with teams, and I know one team that is in fact very interested is the San Francisco Giants, who have Bob Melvin as their manager, who managed Chapman in Oakland. So that's a natural fit there. And like the Arizona Diamondbacks were also going to end up being in on Chapman as well, because they were aggressively looking for a third baseman, but they acquired Eugenio Suarez yesterday. So that would seemingly take them out of the market. And I think that could end up being something well, it ends up eliminating a suitor for Chapman. And I think that's going to be something the Blue Jays try to remain involved in and try to continue conversations there with Scott Boras, his agent. And like you mentioned, the starting pitcher thing as well. And I think it's a really interesting one for the Blue Jays. Is it may not be like the most obvious fit right now, but I would not rule out a trade of Alek Manoah. He is someone that they have had conversations about via trade. And I think one team that could make sense, or that did make sense, was the St. Louis Cardinals, but they've added a couple of starters here the last couple of days. And they're still going to continue looking for at least one or two more starting pitchers, so you can never rule anything out. But I think considering their trade history of making deals together, they made a couple of them last year. I would not rule them out as a fit. And I could end up seeing a lot of these other teams thinking about taking a flyer on him because he's a highly talented pitcher coming off a really down season. I think that can end up being something they explore. And if they end up pulling the trigger on a Manoah trade, then they could end up being in the market for another starting pitcher. And there's plenty of different options. Obviously, you look at the high-end options like a Blake Snell or people like that, and I don't think they'd be in that market. But if you look at the other tier of pitchers, you have a Lucas Giolito, you have a Jack Flaherty, a Michael Wacha, and those are good pitchers. Those are the market for pitchers is 10, 15 million in that range for that tier of a starter. So you're gonna have to have a pretty decent appetite to be able to attain one of those guys. But if they end up trading Manoah, I think that can end up definitely putting them in the market for a starting pitcher, especially in that tier.
I'll tell you right now, though, if the big splash is bringing back Matt Chapman, who was not exactly popular the second half of the season here, and signing Lucas Giolito, people are not going to be pleased. People are not going to be like, wow, what a splash that this baseball team made. Now we're getting the season tickets renewed. The Manoah thing is super interesting because, the most obvious destination was St. Louis, and you mentioned maybe this doesn't – I don't know if Lance Lynn takes you out of wanting to acquire Alek Manoah, right? Like the reasoning would probably still be there for that team. But there's all these starting pitchers that appear to be available via trade, right? Like I was seeing Ken Rosenthal talk the other day about how it's like Bieber is available, right? And Glasnow is available, and you can go – like Corbin Burns could be available. And I just wonder what the value is right now, like what the market would even look like if Alek Manoah is available.
Yeah, and you mentioned those guys too, and it's a pretty extensive trade market for these starting pitchers, and if like to go through the list of the guys that you just mentioned, I think Tyler Glasnow is virtually a guarantee to be traded, and he's a guy that's on an expiring contract, but he's making $25 million this year, so acquiring him is it could end up being tough for a lot of these teams just because of that contract and how big it is, especially for a one-year deal. I still think the Atlanta Braves make a lot of sense there as far as Glasnow. I would not anticipate a Corbin Burns trade. From what I can gather, it's a pretty unlikely scenario that he gets moved, and they want to enter next year with him and Willie Adames and some of those guys on the roster because they want to compete next year. I think a guy to really watch for in the trade market, and I don't know if the Blue Jays would be in on this, but Dylan Cease. I would really not rule out a trade there at all. I think that's one where if I had to handicap the odds of him getting moved, it's probably about like a 60-40, and he is going to require a pretty sizable haul of prospects in return. And I don't know if the Blue Jays will part with the pieces that it would take to get him, especially with how extensive that market would be because the Dodgers are involved there. And certainly there's other teams involved there as well. But I think he's certainly a name to watch. So it's like the market is definitely full when it comes to these options. And having Manoah on that market as well would further bolster it. But if you look at what he provides something a little bit different than all those guys. Is coming off of a down year. He's signed relatively cheap. And it's still going to, like, it's not going to be like the Blue Jays are just giving him away because he's a valuable asset. But it won't require as much to get him as it would for those other players. And I think that can end up enticing some of these other teams that don't have the appetite to part with a couple of their top prospects for those big pitchers. So I don't think it's impossible that Manoah moves. I don't necessarily think it's likely, but I would not rule it out at the same time.
So if you had to do the same thing, handicap that one, you'd say this one's more of a 50-50?
That's exactly the odds I was going to put it, Manoah. I would say it's about 50-50 or maybe 40-60 in that range.
Okay.
That's where I put it.
So last one from me. I feel there's been basically no conversation about Jordan Hicks, and when the Blue Jays traded for him, the big insinuation was, hey, this is a guy that they're not just trading for now. This is someone that they're going to try to hit the negotiating table with. They gave Chad Green some money. Do you think that the Blue Jays bring back Jordan Hicks?
I think it's something they're definitely exploring, and he's a very valuable bullpen arm. And if you look at him, he provides something that not many of these relievers can. Like he can really provide. He can hum it up to about 100 and in a low 100 mile an hour, and when he's on, he's about as talented of a reliever as there is in baseball. And he is someone that has a pretty extensive market right now, from what I can gather. And at the trade deadline, he was one of the more coveted pieces on the market. And I don't know if this was reported or not, but I'm under the impression that at the trade deadline, he was almost traded to the Arizona Diamondbacks. And then the Blue Jays ended up getting him at the last second. And that was somebody that they had targeted pretty extensively with conversations with the St. Louis Cardinals. And I would imagine they're definitely going to continue trying to keep him. But the market for him is, as I said, it's extensive. It could get pretty expensive. So I don't necessarily know if they're going to be able to keep him, but I believe they're going to try for sure.
Hey, Robert, I really appreciate you making time on a holiday to come on here and do this, man. Thanks so much for doing it, and I hope we talk to you soon.
Let's make it happen. I appreciate you guys having me, and happy holidays.
You too, man. Take care. Robert Murray, again, by Robert Murray on Twitter, MLB Insider for FanSided.